right? In other words, it's only in the capitalist era that people have to invent this category of realism. And it might, to be true to our Guy Debord's and our Andre Bretons, we would say it's because capitalism was derealizing things that artists felt the need to establish a realist movement.
Right. And I'm right. And I'm starting from that position that this is actually, the return to realism was a response to the fucking Twitter files, right? It was a response to the way the state was derealizing our understanding. All right, welcome to the Cutrone Zone again. I'm Douglas Lane. I am the author of Pick Your Battle, a book that was self-published back in 2011 or 12 or so. It's filled with Zizekian observations. And with me today is everyone's favorite track coach, contrarian, the last Marxist and master strategist, resident genius, Chris Cutrone. Chris?
Hi, Doug.
Hey. So we're going to talk about you as a master strategist, and we're going to talk about the campaign for a socialist party, but I want to do it from the perspective of someone who's just trying to figure out what anyone who wants to be a socialist might have to do if they wanted to create the foundation for independent socialist politics. And that's really the question.
It is.
So, I guess my first question for you is, what do you see as the primary problem for would-be socialists today that organizing might overcome?
Well, I think that there are a lot of presuppositions that people get as leftists, as progressives, as what have you, as members of a kind of alternative, bohemian kind of social and cultural space, as people educated in academia, by academic leftists. So really, there's a lot that has to be unlearned, or there's a different kind of contact with reality that has to take place. Or another way that I've been thinking about it the last couple of years is people have to be disciplined in a different way, right? So they have to be disciplined by, actual practice and social reality. Not really go down the rabbit hole of theoretical casuistry, because I think that theory really is a profound dead end. I think in terms of my own education, I don't think that Adorno would have made sense to me if I hadn't already been a Marxist and already had a sense of the relationship between Marxism and social and political reality. I think if I didn't have a strong sense of that, including like academic study of like history of movements and parties in various parts of the world. I studied revolution. I studied revolutionary parties, revolutionary movements, organizations. That's what my undergraduate study was about as a poli-sci major. And as a student of like people like Iqbal Ahmad and informal student, but still a student of Adolf Reed, like, political science, political, philosophy, political theory type people who thought about like nuts and bolts of political movements and organizations and parties and, revolutionary processes taking over the state, in Cuba or Korea or China or Soviet Union, or, I studied the South African movement. I studied Iran, the Islamic Revolution. I did really thorough study of these things, as well as being an activist. And getting advice on activism from people who were serious. So, I kind of feel like if I didn't have that, I don't know what Adorno would mean to me. It would be some nonsense. It would be some like random literary references. It would be some, I don't know, some weird philosophical sensibility. I was actually thinking recently about, One of the editors of the Columbia University Press series that publishes Frankfurt School stuff, right? I was on a panel with her, a platypus panel. And literally, she said at a certain point, she said, Chris, you're trying to make Benjamin and Adorno say things, whereas they didn't think that you can say things the way you're trying to make them say things. And I was like, wait, they are saying things, and they're not saying you can't say anything. That would be like Derrida, and that wouldn't even be Derrida, actually. That would be some caricature of Derrida. But she is literally a gatekeeper of academic publishing on the Frankfurt School. She's a full tenured, named chair professor who is like, resistant to the idea that Adorno had anything to say, definitely, but also that it was Marxism. She hated that. She was like, Chris, you're trying to make them into Marxists. They weren't Marxists. And I was like, if they're not Marxists, they're nothing. And I really had a sense of what that meant. But, so we come into it, this world of the left. I'm an academic and I teach critical theory, but we come into it really backwards. And like I said, I don't know what these ideas would mean if I didn't have a sense of reality. So the first task of would-be socialists, it's a Socialist Unity article. I start out a little tongue-in-cheek preaching to the socialist intelligentsia. It's like, but are you really socialists? Or is socialism just a sort of a pose or an affect? Like what is your socialism? Again, Zoran Mamdani is, maybe going to be mayor of New York. And he's basically someone who is a socialist culturally, but not really intellectually, and certainly not politically. Right? And so politically, what does it mean to be a socialist? People have been avoiding that for a long time. That's the bad legacy of the 60s, is the left became a subculture. Or it's what Adolf Fried called posing as politics.
The aim of the campaign is to learn from local efforts to participate in civil society organizing around a variety of issues, tenant organizing, helping with helping the immigrant community protect themselves from the police or from ICE. It can be just social activity. There was recently an interview published at the Sublation Substack with someone who was doing drawing circles regularly just in her community. There's a variety of just civil society or just everyday social activity.
Tutoring.
A variety of things that people are doing. After Occupy Wall Street fell apart as an occupation in parks around the country, this was the move they tried to make, and I recall it.
Yep.
And I recall feeling that at the time it was actually a way to obscure the defeat of Occupy Wall Street, that they were not continuing Occupy Wall Street in a different form, but they were retreating into regular basic like Democratic Party or other forms of already existing leftist activism. And I talked to someone who was involved with that around that time, maybe a year later. We got real drunk at the local bar, and I got so drunk that I saw double in that meeting. But anyhow,
in Portland.
In Portland, just down the street. But anyhow, while I was still sober enough to remember what we were talking about, he described how they moved from being, a protest movement and a quasi-occupation challenging capitalism directly, symbolically, which is what it was, to doing sit-down strikes and providing legal support for people who were being evicted from their homes around the economic crisis.
Oh yeah, anti-eviction, yeah.
And how that became got absorbed basically in the already existing networks of progressive legal assistance programs and other kinds of already existing institutions. And that what they could do is they could organize protests and try to get media involvement for individuals. But it really atomized Occupy Wall Street.
Let me say something about this. So there have been sort of two moves like this. So one, Occupy, first of all, was dominated by anarchists. It was like David Graeber style anarchism. It was like the spokes council structure, right, from Madagascar, right, from his ethnographic research into primitive communism or whatnot. And there was that move, and I think that hampered them. In other words, having an anarchist ideology hampered their ability to be more than an adjunct of the Democratic Party. And I know that that's going to offend people who are anarchists, but sorry, in other words, you are default Democrats. And similarly, DSA also has tried to do activism. But again, it's base building for the Democrats, right? So the idea is that the Democrats lack an adequate base, and there's class de-alignment, right? There isn't realignment, like they refuse to believe that the working class is really voting for Trump, but there's rather de-alignment of the Democrats from the working class. Okay, now in between those two, there was the Marxist Center and there was the Philly Socialists. And they have a slightly different history going back to the anti-war movement and going back to the new SDS and that kind of thing. But that also hasn't really gone anywhere. And I think that the problem, therefore, is means and ends and, what goal we're building towards, like what the actual goal is. And that's why, I formulated the way I did as socialist unity, meaning, okay, socialism, like it's socialism. And so it's not like, oh, we're going to be like the liberal NGOs, except subpar. It's like, no, okay, we want to know the landscape, so we'll work with the liberal NGOs. We'll apprentice. We'll train from them. Like here with Arise, Jorge Mujica's organization in Chicago. It's an already existing. Latino community, immigrant rights, immigrant workers' rights kind of center, and he's a communist from Mexico, right? Who's a member of the Morena Party, who is the sort of pop front communist party in Mexico and is the ruling party in Mexico. And Jorge likes to say it's the largest leftist organization in the United States because of the number of Mexicans in the United States who are also members of that party. It's kind of a cute idea, but they're obviously ghettoized. And it is some kind of liberal NGO. And, he has run against established Democrats for alderman here in Chicago, mostly as a protest candidate. I don't know that he really wanted to be alderman. But, and so he's one step removed from the Democrats, but also he has to deal with the Democrats because they control Chicago. So fine, we're going to be trained in this kind of activity by them. And in so doing, and in doing the activity, and taking it outside of the Latino community into other communities, other immigrant communities, and out of the city into the suburbs, and doing it in other cities, whereas he's Chicago-based, his organization is Chicago-based, we're going to learn about social reality. We're going to train ourselves. The first task is to train ourselves. Are we going to accomplish anything in terms of stopping deportations? Maybe, maybe not. But that's not the goal. The goal is to train ourselves. So we're not just helping the people, or we're not doing social activity like providing like services or something. We are, but the main goal is to train ourselves. And train ourselves in terms of organizing and activism, but also learn about social and political reality, because political reality does interface with social reality. And look, young people, they have no experience of this whatsoever. None. And so just some basic experience. And just keeping in mind that the goal is, as I put it in the meeting, we had a campaign for the Socialist Party meeting, and I said, what are we actually doing? We are building an army. We're building an army. And, keeping that in mind, we're training ourselves as an army, and an army takes all kinds. An army has secretaries, nurses, it has, stock clerks, It has all kinds of people involved. In other words, an army is not just soldiers, frontline soldiers. It's not. It's a whole apparatus. We are building an army. And, look, the capitalist parties know that they're armies. And there are other movements. So in the meeting, I said it's like Hamas, or it's like Hezbollah. I said the army of God. That's what Hezbollah means in Lebanon. And we are an army of God, and our God is socialism. But it's an army. And just understanding that. And how do you start an army? Well, we're learning that. How do you go from Che Guevara and some friends to building an army that overthrows a state? Right? But we're not going to do but that's what we're doing.
Yeah, this helps me understand, and I should help everyone watching this understand just why it's important to keep Sublation and the campaign separate in your minds, because
Yes.
Sublation is not building an army. That is not what Sublation is doing at all. In fact, I want to have enough distance as a good bourgeois liberal type, journalist, writer, artist type. I want to have enough distance to be able to fucking report on your army and what's going, I don't really trust armies that much. That's my instinct is not to really love armies.
Right.
Of
course.
But I also want to report on the prospects for and the necessity of the development of socialism.
Right.
And if it takes an army, I'm not going to stand in the way because of some squeamishness or something either, right? But that's not what Sublation is about.
Yeah, the analogy to an army is limited in the sense that a movement, right? So obviously an army, that's not politically sufficient, nor is it socially.
You're not building a militia, which is all you could do.
Right. Well, I mean, the point of the matter is that there were communist guerrilla armies that took state power in Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, China, and Yugoslavia. I was just reading about Tito and Tito's break with Stalin. And you know what he did when he broke with Stalin? He arrested thousands of Stalinists and imprisoned and tortured and executed them. And that's how he wasn't a Stalinist, Doug.
Right?
It's no, that's
no. I know. I mean,
right?
I know that is, and we should take that seriously. He wasn't a Stalinist. He was arresting and torturing and killing the Stalinists.
Stalinists, right? But to my mind, of course, that's what makes him a Stalinist. And it also, to my mind, shows the limitations of the guerrilla road to power. Right. Meaning you don't want to be a partisan army that takes power, because then your state is going to be basically a constant military operation. Yeah. And so there's a limit to the analogy, because it is an analogy. And so, I think I said at the meeting, Jesus didn't start an army, but Peter and Paul did. Mm-hmm. And Muhammad definitely did. Right. The Buddha, maybe not. I mean, he was a warrior prince to begin with. So, and so because I was saying that, I was bringing up the point that we are, a socialist movement is going to be misperceived as either a gang or a church. And that's why I use those analogies, because by their opponents, it will be seen as a racket, as a gang, as an illegitimate business, and as a protection racket, for the working class. And it will be seen as a church. It will be seen as a church of the working class. This is what the anti-socialists saw the socialists as back in the day. They were like, oh, that's the church of the working class, because they understood that the churches were the churches of the bourgeoisie.
Right, and they were.
And they were, and they are.
Right.
Right? They are, right?
I mean, and the bourgeoisie had to create churches, literally.
Yeah.
As a part of the revolutionary struggle.
Absolutely.
Right. But there were also like churches of reason and all sorts of little.
Oh yeah, they got very, very developed on this score, didn't they? They did, right? Yeah. And so we're going to be seen that way anyway. And so my motto is always admit everything, concede nothing. Meaning there's a kernel of truth in seeing it that way. If our enemies are going to see us as gangsters and as cult church, it's like Scientology or Mormons or something, right? Then we have to, in a sense, own it. We have to say, okay, in what way are we going to be like these things? And then think about how we're not going to be like those things, but only insofar as those things are not sufficient to bring about socialism. Right? So we're going to have to be at least a gang and at least a church, but more than a gang and more than a church, because the socialist movement has to be more than those things. The capitalist parties have to be more than those things too. They are political parties in a very degraded way, but still on some basic elemental level they have to be political. And so of course the Socialist Party has to be political. But at what point does the Socialist Party have to be political? So here's the tricky thing. See, you can start a capitalist party today, and you can be political immediately in a way that socialists can't. Because you can start a capitalist party today, and you can immediately go to the capitalists and say, you should support me. And they can say, yes, I agree, and how do I send you a check? And how do I provide resources for you? How can I get my church involved? How can I get my Rotary Club involved? Well, the working class doesn't have these things ready at hand the way the capitalists do. Right? How can I invite you to the university I'm on the board of trustees for to give a talk? We don't have these things. Socialists, the working class doesn't have these things. And so that's why we can't be immediately political the way capitalist political parties can be startups. We can't, right? And I think that's the thing, is that people want to be the Socialist Party startup the way a capitalist party can be a startup party. And it's like, it doesn't work that way, because you will end up just being a gang or a church. You won't be able to be political because there is no political constituency yet. So we're trying to build a political constituency for a socialist party, and it has to start out by building a social constituency, because unlike the bourgeoisie, the working class is not already there as a social constituency. It's not already socially constituted.
Right, but I mean,
really
it sounds
exist.
to me like what you're saying is that you really do have to be a gang and a church first in order to build a constituency so you can be political.
Yes. So this is going to be the danger that we have to navigate. In other words, we're going to be entertaining all the pitfalls of those things without necessarily having the advantages of them. In other words, we'll be like a subpar gang in a subpar church. And that's just going to be what we have to suffer through,
How I feel like I am more likely to be involved with the church part.
Exactly. Of course.
Yeah.
You're an intellectual.
Right. So what would the pitfalls be? And I'm going to express what I think the pitfalls for me as a church organizer might be. I make obscure, difficult stuff that doesn't offer people much in the way of consolation. I don't
Consolation.
Yeah, I don't offer them a vision that is unchallenging and that is always clear. Even if you want to be starting a church, you want to say to them, oh, if you believe these three things and show up here and donate and recruit this many people, your soul will be saved. And I will say to them, if you read these texts and write with me in this way and think about these things and watch this obscure film, we can talk about it. Like
you're treating like academia a little bit. And so let's talk about that. So it's kind of like,
but is that academic? Because there's also a way like artists and writers have formed schools of
academic like that. I mean, the problem is that we have bureaucratized academia rather than real academia, but it would still be academia, right? Yes, writer colonies were set up, artist colonies were set up, like communes, we might even call them, right? To train people to be artists, to train people to be writers. We could do that. Now, so here's the thing, though. So it's kind of like you'd want to be a good writer to do that. You'd want to be a good theologian to start your own church, right? You'd have to be aware of the stakes. You don't want to go in like amateur hour because it'll be self-limiting, meaning it will be like, okay, you can have a tiny church, right? And the thing with churches also, and here's how the analogy would play out for us now with the campaign for a socialist party, is Christian churches, and I guess other churches probably have a similar kind of notion, the doing good works, right? And so it's kind of like people might know churches as a civil social organization through things like really therapeutic services that they provide, like AA meetings, or do you know?
Or soup kitchens, or
Yeah, they
Meals
can
on
do that kind
Wheels,
of stuff. They can do that kind of stuff too. But what I'm thinking
or
is,
consulting people who are grieving.
yeah, they can provide therapy basically. And so I immediately had come to mind like Clement Greenberg. Like Clement Greenberg talks about how the avant-garde is the resistance to art becoming either pure commodification entertainment, or what happened to religion, therapy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
This is what I'm saying. This is why I don't feel like I can help in terms of making a church, right? And creating a church, because I don't want to do either of those things.
A writer's workshop can develop into therapy because art can develop into therapy.
Yeah.
And
I had someone tell me that writing for the workshop helped their self-esteem and help them reconsider.
And no doubt it does, right? So in other words, no doubt art has a therapeutic function. And there's even at my school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, there's a department called the Art and Therapy Department.
Well, yeah.
Right? But now that's a real thing, right?
No, I know. There's art therapy. There literally is art therapy.
Yeah.
You can be a psychologist and practice art therapy.
Practice art therapy. And so we have to be careful about that because, again, we just have to be aware that actually for art to be art, it has to be more than just therapy, right? And so it can be therapy also, but it can't primarily be that. And similarly, our activity can be therapeutic also for others, for ourselves, like our organizing, but it can't only be that. In other words, it's a means to an end. It can't just be a means as an end in itself. And that's kind of like when art becomes therapy, it becomes like a healthier neurosis. So like paint instead of do self-harm, or something like that. Like do this neurotic activity rather than that other neurotic activity. Write instead of becoming a drug addict, right? It can't just be that, because then it's not really art or literature, right?
Right.
And it's really only for yourself, right? So we have to be careful that the point of all this is not just for ourselves. It does serve a higher purpose, and in that sense it's political, but also social. It's social in an emphatic societal sense, rather than social in the sense of merely socializing with people, a reason to get together with people, a club. And look, I've been on the left long enough. The left is just affinity groups. It's a club. It's a social circle. It's a friend circle. And it's kind of like a weird, deranged version of that. It's like a friendship circle where the friendship circle is policed by ideology. It's like, well, who needs that? And I don't know, maybe friendship circles are policed by other things, like sports fandom or something. I don't know, you know what I mean? But like, to me, it's like, yeah. And so I just had to say at the meeting, look, we're not here to make friends. We might make friends as a side benefit, but we're not here to make friends. That's not the purpose.
Right.
We're here to make comrades of each other. And, we do have a higher purpose here. And that makes a difference. The ends do change the significance of the means. And I want to say all means are good. However, no, right? I don't think that. I think that on the ends of the spectrum, the drawing circle. Do you remember stitching and bitching?
Yeah.
The knitting circle for like women involved on the left.
Yeah. It was a feminist
stitching and bitching
social circle.
Yeah, and it was like, no, we're not doing that. And we're not doing that saying that drawing is like art, whereas knitting is not. Because maybe knitting is art.
Yeah.
I don't know,
It can be.
It's a craft.
I think I've seen things that are knitted in museums.
Absolutely you have. But that's because of the liquidation of art in our lifetime. Right? They've put everything in the museums. Or they put it in as ethnographic. Yeah. But so I think that that's the point of like saying it's an army, is to give a sense of seriousness, danger, purpose, not violence, and also power. Right? In other words, we are trying to build power. We are. Like, and we shouldn't pretend we're not. We shouldn't, pretend otherwise, and we shouldn't dissimulate on that front. And I do think that, like, I don't know, the DSA, like, what are they? I think I've described them as a ginger group on the margins of the Democratic Party. That's what Michael Harrington wanted them to be. He didn't really want to try to take over the Democratic Party. He did not. Because the possibilities of that were limited, and also that it would be kind of contrary to their purposes, that it would liquidate democratic socialism to try to take over the Democratic Party. So they were just trying to sort of influence it on the margins. Maybe hold some elected offices, but not even assume that one could accomplish very much in that way. Right?
Why? Why did they want to influence the Democratic Party? I mean, I read
because there was no option. Like, in other words, it was Reagan. It was in response to Reagan. It was Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and New American Movement, and they had gone through the 70s. Reagan was elected, and it was like, you know what? Yeah, we have to find some other thing to do now in the face of this. And so they did the DSA. They made the DSA. It's like 1982. And it's in response to Reaganism. In other words, they had higher aspirations. Both the New American Movement and DSOC had higher aspirations in the 70s that they abandoned very self-consciously in forming the DSA under Reagan. And so the degree to which the DSA has grown under Trump, first term and now, people have to understand Harrington was clear what that meant. It meant giving up. Like the growth of the
and
DSA
everyone thought it was like
up.
Everyone pretended like joining the DSA was fighting back or doubling down.
Back in the day, in the 80s, they knew better.
Right.
They knew better, that they could only slowly influence the Democratic Party to be a little bit more progressive, and in the meantime, they could maintain their democratic socialism, which was, they understood, not going to ever be realized through the Democratic Party.
What did they mean by progressive, by the way? Just expand the welfare state? Is that what they meant? Or?
Sure. In other words, like, capitalism can go in a more progressive or more reactionary direction. And in some vague sense, that might be true. But the illusion, it was look, the Fordist welfare state was understood by everyone. Michael Harrington, his mentor Max Shachtman, it was understood by everyone to have been an obstacle to socialism. It was understood, right? And so it wasn't like, oh, this is a better form of capitalism. It was rather, this is the capitalism we have to deal with.
Right. So I want to say something about sublation at this point to sort of put this in perspective. What happened to me and the project that I started as one person's podcast that then became a project within a publishing effort, 0 books, and now is in Sublation with a variety of people involved, is that it began as an autodidactic attempt to understand what was happening in society and what it meant for me and what the prospects for the left were and what the prospects for socialism were, right? Or for workers' power, maybe. But really, it was more like, what is the prospects for this thing that I've been involved in, the left? That's what it was about. And at this point, I feel as though instead of being faced with that question, I'm faced with the question, a different one, which is, how can we even understand the left or reality or our social circumstances? Like, what are the barriers to that? Because I see around me people who have been involved in the project for a long time, and even my own activity being occluded in various ways and being unable to really rise to the level of.
Let me get back to this point about the kind of capitalism we have to deal with, right?
Right.
Meaning, did socialists think that FDR New Dealism was progressive? No, not really. And the Stalinists pretended to think that it was progressive because of the Popular Front, because they knew that they needed to work with FDR to defeat Hitler. So they had to call FDR progressive, even if they didn't really think he was progressive.
By the way, that word progressive to me means statist and administrative.
It does, absolutely. I mean, back in the day, in the Eugene Debs era, like the socialists, and in the SPD in Germany, there was a progressive party in Germany. And there was a progressive movement in the United States in the era of Debs, and the socialists knew that they were not that, and that those people were working against them. And they were an enemy. But they were also an enemy with a constituency that the socialists ultimately had to win over, namely middle class. Right? And so the question is, they knew very, very much, because they were Marxists, they knew that the danger was that the working class would fall under petty bourgeois leadership. And they saw that in the progressives. And so their attitude was, okay, we got to navigate this landscape. They understood progressivism as an expression of the crisis of capitalism. But they understood that ultimately progressives, even when they thought that they were anti-capitalist, were just an engine for maintaining capitalism. And so the question was, how do you win the middle class to the side of the working class, as opposed to the side of the progressive capitalists? So the question is, what's progressive? Progressive is just what capitalism needs. So today, Trump is progressive. He is. That's it. Reagan is progressive, Trump's progressive, Nixon was progressive. And insofar as they're opposed by the Democrats are conservative. Now, sometimes they switch roles, and the Democrats are doing what needs to be done, and the Republicans are there to say, not so fast. And historically, that's been the case since FDR, is that the Republicans are the not so fast people. And the Democrats are like, no, we have to do this. Right? But now, Trump is doing what needs to be done. And that's why you can have this specter of like MAGA leftism, like a Zoran Mamdani, some kind of MAGA leftist or something. And it's like, yeah, you're just kind of like, not quite grasping the point, which is progressive is just whatever capitalism needs in a new circumstance. And if it's not the nominal progressives, then it will be the nominal conservatives. But the nominal conservatives will be the actual progressives, and the nominal progressives will be the actual conservatives. And it's just a division of labor between them. It's not some deep principle difference. It's not even good cop, bad cop. It's just, we think this should be done, and the others are like, really? Do you really think that's necessary? Is that really necessary? What about the downsides? That's the only difference between progressive and conservative. And, you know, and again, it's what we're talking about. Like maybe, again, back to our time, fiscally conservative, socially progressive. Do you remember that? Yeah. Right, because liberal meant progressive back then. Right? Which smuggles in all sorts of things. Right? Because it obscures a lot, because it's kind of like liberal means like, oh, the state should leave it alone. Well, no, actually, it means the state should direct it. Right? That's why it's really progressivism and not liberalism. And also, we should understand that the conservatives are conservative liberals, meaning they're the ones who are like, maybe the state should not direct this. Right. And that's a different axis. But we're talking about capitalism, what needs to be done, progressivism, conservatism. Now, look, socialists, would-be socialists, the socialist intelligentsia, the left, you know, Benedict Cryptofash was right. It's just the left wing of capitalism. Of course it is. That's all that these leftists are. They're just the left wing of capitalism. They read Das Kapital in order to tell them what a better way of doing capitalism might be.
You cannot read it that way. It does not offer you that.
Millions of people do, Doug. except millions of people do, because I don't know if Marx was too good a writer or too bad a writer. I don't know what it is. It's like how did the Nazis get fascism out of Nietzsche?
Yeah,
It's not
but
there.
by obscuring him and by
Yeah.
with the help of his sister, I've heard.
Yeah.
That's gossip, but yeah.
And then, of course, the opponents are happy to say, oh, just like the Republicans are happy to say that Marx was some kind of progressive, that the progressives really are Marxists.
Right? I mean, but
Right.
nonetheless, like you cannot read Das Kapital and expect to be given guidance on how to properly run.
Well, what it does, it works this way. Marx will tell you how capitalism works. And then once you know how it works, you can figure out how to make it work better. That's how it works. And it's like, actually, Das Kapital does not tell you how capitalism works. It does not. It tells you how it doesn't work.
Yeah, right. It tells you how, even if it worked perfectly by its own standards, it doesn't work. That's the point of capital.
But that's not the way people read it. People read it as this is the system. Marx is describing the system by which the workers are shafted by the capitalists, and that's not what Marx wrote.
No, and by the way, but the little sectarian groups like the one I went through, the MHI, at least gets that right. They definitely
But they fudge it too, Doug, because of their politics. They fudge that difference. They fudge the difference between this shows how the workers are shafted by the capitalists, and this shows how capitalism destroys itself, which is not the same thing, but people fudge that difference. And they think capitalism not working means shafting the workers. And it's like, only in a certain sense is that what that means.
Yeah. Look, the reason I got thrown out of that group was because when Trump got elected, I said, we can't stop being Marxist just because Trump got elected. That was basically my response. It's like, you can't drop your critique of the Democrats,
right,
and their attempt to take over the left and redefine what the economic crisis meant, and offer Keynesian or Fordist or welfare state solutions. You can't drop that in reaction to Trump and just say everything is about Trump. And what they said, well, we'll meet you halfway. We'll continue to attack the progressives inside the Democratic Party and be anti-Trump and support Clinton and and the center, or Clinton, or Jeb Bush, or anyone who wasn't Trump.
I think CPUSA supported Hillary over Bernie.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on who you ask.
It's like a mixed bag, but I think that at a certain point, and so I think that it's one of these funny things. So again, progressivism. Now, there was, in the New Left, there was this idea that maybe a revolutionary crisis will be produced by bankrupting the welfare state. Right? So you kind of advocate among poor people to claim all their welfare benefits because the welfare state is predicated on very few, relatively like low claims on benefits. And so, there is, maybe Zoran Mamdani has this idea that if he did everything he said he wants to do in New York, that somehow that will bring about some revolutionary crisis of capitalism.
No, it just means that all that will do is create a fiscal crisis or something, and then he'll get voted out.
Right, exactly. That's what will happen, right? But I feel like the New Left was clearer about the means and the ends. And I don't think that was a good strategy on their part, but at least they were thinking, whereas it's unclear now what people are thinking. Like, where is this going? Where is this going to go? Like, what do you think the result of this would be? Are we supposed to have a national healthcare system, a national public healthcare system, in order to bankrupt capitalism, or is it meant to make capitalism more cost efficient? Because that's the only way it would happen, is if it was a cost efficiency thing. It would not happen if it's going to bankrupt the system. Right? And so if you think that you're making these demands because you want to bankrupt the system, you're fooling yourself. You're not fooling anyone else, but you are fooling yourself. And so this is the thing. And so for us to just know from the get-go, because Harrington and his people, they probably did have this idea that progressive reforms in capitalism bring about a crisis, sharpen the contradictions. It's like a Trotskyist idea, it's like a Stalinist idea, it's a 20th century idea. In other words, that, okay, socialist revolution's not on the agenda, but in the meantime, maybe Adolf Reed has this idea, or Moïse Postone would have had this idea. Why Moïse Postone was a Democrat? Because he was. Because it's kind of like, well, maybe it will make the problem of capitalism clearer to people. You do these reforms, it doesn't really work, and that shows people that more has to be done.
Right. Benjamin Studebaker described this to me over 2 sessions. The last week and then the week before. The week before we talk about the limits of trade unionism, basically. Right. And then this week we talked about the necessity for a kind of nationalist politics, I think.
Yep.
And
so the limits of the nation state.
Right. Exactly. And I was somewhat skeptical of that approach.
Well, it's not going to work that way. It's not going to play out that way. And, rhetorical positions and substantive positions are quite different. In other words, like Trump and the Trumpists can be rhetorically as nationalist as they want to be, but how nationalist are they really going to be? Substantially. And I think that's the problem, is that we can't enter into these debates on the basis of a kind of demagogic rhetoric on the part of the capitalist parties, as if they're substantive, because they're not. And I would just say that we need to know going into it, one of the things that would-be socialists who are intellectuals, they need to disabuse themselves of all these things. And I feel like there are many ways that can happen. But one way would be discipline through contact with social reality. Meaning, and really thinking through, okay, what are we trying to do, really? And what is the goal? And how are we heading towards that goal in this activity that we're doing? Right? Because the anarchists have an easy way of solving that problem. Like you brought up Occupy, which is that they really think that you organize people to like withdraw from capitalism and withdraw from the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. If that could work, that would be fine. I don't think it can work. Like, I don't think it works that way. I do think that, like, these kinds of cooperative efforts are what Marx called a free gift to capital.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I started, I mentioned at the beginning that I wrote this book called Pick Your Battles, right? And it was all about, like, kitchen gardens and foraging, and like basically trying to develop alternative agricultural and economic systems under capitalism that would allow us to have the base to survive without capitalism. That was the point of it. And it was coming up around the economic crisis. And I was really talking to mostly right-wingers, former hippies, right, who were interested and these kinds of sustainable agricultural projects and small-scale farming,
survival
and
strategies,
survivalist stuff. And then I also would read anarchists say, like, let's reconsider how we design cities. Let's plant lots of fruit trees everywhere so nobody will ever be hungry, and let's give everyone free access to various kinds of food stuff, just as a part of civic, planning. And so I was looking at all that, and I investigated that, and I like wandered my neighborhood and collected fruits and sort of things like that while reading people like Althusser and Zizek and Balabar but these post-Marxists.
Yeah, and I suppose
and talking to Jody Dean, I interviewed her during that time.
And it can all make a kind of sense.
Well, what I definitely came to was that even the post-Marxists would not allow me to believe in that anarchist utopian vision. That I recognize that just in terms of logistics, there was no way.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you could say at the level of scale. I think that's the way Marx puts it. It's like a drop in the bucket.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing I realized was that there was a way that all of this had a function
Mm-hmm.
in society as it was, and it was as a supplemental ideological supplement to modernity, giving bohemian middle class people
Yep.
a sense of some sort of authenticity and
Authenticity. Mm-hmm.
right and resistance. It made life more bearable under these conditions for some, and that's what all it amounted to. And that was the whole point of my,
Now the
little.
problem with like Germany is they're statists. Of course, they're not anarchists, but they're the statists,
Right.
meaning they think that there was actually existing socialism. That China, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Korea are some kind of socialist reality,
Right.
actually existing socialism. And no, and sorry, definitively no. Like we know now, right?
Mm-hmm.
People knew back then too, but we have no excuse not to know that it's
Right.
not actually existing socialism. It's capitalism. And of course, they're going to be like, oh, dialectic capitalism and socialism. Yes, but how? Right? And so, strategically, how are we going to build a movement of the working class in the metropolitan country
Right.
to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat? And that's the other point, right? That gives people the heebie-jeebies. Because people are happy to be state socialists. They don't have to think too much about how to get there. In other words, they're happy to be fans of actually existing socialism because it lets them off the hook of how to actually achieve it here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a worshiping of the accomplished fact.
Right.
And then you can point to movements in Nepal or India or Philippines and or in South America, and you can say, oh, see, actually existing socialist movements. And Chris Cutrone and Doug Lane are just, can just fuck off because they're just talking about some metropolitan leftist intellectuals. But no.
Right.
But no, right? And so again, we have to really get serious at this point. And, not fool ourselves about this. And not abdicate and not just be fans of something or other, fans of movements elsewhere, fans of states elsewhere. No. And, because ultimately it's not a taste community. It's not about what you like or dislike, what you're a fan of or not. Right?
Right.
It's not about that. It's about what are we supposed to actually do? Not what are we supposed to approve of mentally.
Right.
Or feel good about. It's what we actually have to do. And can we be organizers? Can we be activists? Can we be some kind of auxiliary support staff for a movement as intellectuals? I think a lot of people who are now socialist intellectuals will not be members of the Socialist Party, and they will just disappear into the nooks and crannies of crankdom. I mean, that's already happening, but that will be the fate of, people who are like, I think the Eugene Debs Socialist Party of America is predicated on the wrong theory. De Leon, and then he just rendered himself politically irrelevant that way. So we'll be like that, and so, not everyone who calls himself a leftist or a socialist or a Marxist now will be part. No, they won't. In fact, most won't. The vast majority won't because they're just fanboys and fangirls of whatever, and it's just a feel thing and a mental satisfaction thing. And ultimately, when the chips are down, it's really about who do you support in capitalist politics.
Right.
And for us, we just have to start with, we can have feelings and thoughts about whatever is going on in capitalist politics, but we have to understand it's not our concern. It's not our concern. We can't affect it. And even if we could affect it, it wouldn't be in the service of socialism.
Mm-hmm.
So we might as well be happy that we can't affect it. Right? If we could affect it, we have to understand that it would be contrary to what's needed to be done in terms of organizing the working class, self-organizing of the working class as an independent force. And again, that brings back the question of the gang or the church of the working class.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, look, the labor movement would have to be remade fundamentally and would be illegal. Right? It would have to break all the NLRB rules and laws. It would have to break all the labor laws in order to be a real labor movement. In order to be a real labor movement, just in a liberal sense,
Mm-hmm.
like an actual civil social force of collective bargaining, to do that, it would have to break all existing labor laws and regulations.
Right. And for workers to do that, they'd have to feel like it was worthwhile to break the law.
Yes. Yeah,
right?
That it wouldn't just be punished, right? That it wouldn't just, expose you to criminalization, that it was actually something real, that would not, that where the police and the state would not be able to simply throw everybody in jail because they can't.
Right.
So we have the existing labor unions as an obstacle to what needs to be done, and they are gangs, they are rackets, and they have resources and they have connections to the state and to the political parties and to the capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a real uphill climb.
Right.
It really is. And we just have to gird ourselves for that. We have to be prepared for that. We have to have the patience for that.
Yep. Well, I want to talk about theory and practice in the second half, because I do think that the split between theory and practice is important for Sublation as a self-reflective part of a socialist movement aligned with the campaign, friendly with Platypus, friendly with actually a lot of socialists that would like to be actually socialists, right? Friendly with any socialist wants to be a socialist.
Yes.
But it's still, I mean, like
Coming
I've
at it
tried.
from theory.
Yeah, like I'm trying to skirt the issue by going, like retreating, I guess, maybe even into art in a way, or into formalism, but it's not truly formalism because it's aimed at realism rather than just aimed at innovating formally.
Oh yeah.
So
journalism also.
It's journalism, but it's not.
And writing.
And writing, just journalism that can withstand the moment. Because frankly, there are some good journalists out there who aren't quite at the level of realism. You know what I mean?
That's right, because a lot of journalism now, even when it is trying to contend with reality, is still ultimately subject to the dominant discourse.
Right. And I would say, like, Taibbi, as much as he tries not to be, is
inevitably.
I
mean, I've had to struggle with this myself. My compact writing, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this quasi-journalistic essayism and try to provoke thinking with it. And can I really try to invent my own way of talking about things? No. So I have to sort of engage the existing discourse. And then the question is, how can one do that? How can one make the smooth functioning of the discourse kind of gum up and the gears grind a little bit?
But you have to expose the discourse as you expose the object of the journalism itself, right? And
it's very difficult. You do have to engage. I think that we talked about this previously. I've tried to engage very self-consciously in cognitive dissonance as some kind of ersatz dialectics.
Right.
And it's hard because, again, I can only do it in a very limited way. And it might work, it might not work, right? So I have to experiment with it. But it's a very difficult thing because, in fact, authentic journalism would make you question the way people talk about things.
Right. Yeah.
You can't just plug facts into the way things are already talked about. It doesn't work. Because then the facts do become just talking points of the other side.
Yeah. Which is what I've been experiencing.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Russiagate. right?
It's terrible. No, it's absolutely terrible that this is what it inevitably becomes. I mean, you know, like Kellyanne Conway got skewered for this, right? When she said alternative facts. And
Right.
people are like, oh, does she mean alternative to the facts? And no, she just meant if you focus on these facts as opposed to those facts, you get a different narrative. And that's true. And so what happens is that some facts are stigmatized as belonging to the other side. You know, like, oh, if you raise that, if you talk about that, that's just propaganda for the other side. And it's like, well, but it is still a fact you have to deal with, right? You still have to make sense of it. And so it literally is, we don't want to think about that.
And so, yeah, this is what I've been wrestling with, and that's why this, yeah, we'll talk about it on the other side. But I do feel as though my task is for myself as like a writer and filmmaker, and for the people working for them on the magazine and magazine writers, and for the books that we publish and the podcasts that we put out. All of it is about trying to wrestle with breaking with the discourse, not getting subsumed by the discourse. And I fall down on the job.
I would say that the difficulty is this, and I'd put it in terms of art, and also this kind of thing that you've done with like your video essays and like found footage pieces, including our film on the last election, which is, it isn't about exactly breaking the discourse. That it's almost like you have to stress the discourse to the extreme. You have to make the discourse scream. You know, in other words, you can't like just talk a different language, you know, establish another discourse. You can't. Like, you have to sort of make people aware of everything that's naturalized and everything that's built into the discourse, all the assumptions that are there. You have to sort of bring all that out. You know, in other words, I mean, at least I think it's one of these, like, you have to lean into it, you know, meaning and make it tip over, you know, that you can't just resist it, because then you're just going to try to invent your own jargon or something. And people do this. They glom on to like jargon. Especially leftist theory becomes like this weird jargon, and people think that using that jargon, your jargon of authenticity, right? That just the use of language by itself is some kind of resistance to the problem. And it's like, well, actually, it might just be another kind of concession to the problem.
Right.
You know, and so that's, I think, the difficulty, you know, and it's like, I don't know, I thought about Israel, Palestine, like Hasbara, you know, Hasbara. And Hasbara has a very precise meaning. It's like the Israeli state doing propaganda by just reporting on the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the anti-Zionists are like, oh, see, just reporting on the facts is propaganda. And it's like, no, it's a technique of just using the facts as propaganda. It doesn't mean that if you just stick to the facts, it just is inherently propaganda. But that slippage happens, right? And so it's kind of like, yeah, we have to understand that everything tilts in favor of the status quo. It does.
Mm-hmm.
And so what can you do with that? Well, you can make people aware of how it does. You know, that's where the situationism is helpful, actually.
Right.
You know, because it's like, what did they do? They did do cut up videos of dominant imagery in order to make it scream.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, yeah. And that's what I spent my, you know, writerly life trying to perfect and continue. Really, that's the aesthetic that I glom.
Now, I don't know if, you know, journalism can't be that perverse, but it has to be at least aware. Like, in other words, my compact essays is essayism. So essayism can be perverse like that, rhetorically. Journalism can't exactly be, but it can have its moments, and it can certainly be aware.
Don't you think Hunter S. Thompson was sort of that perverse?
Well, he was, but then it wasn't just journalism. It had to be gonzo journalism. In other words, it had to be like hyper subjective in order to get at something objective.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that that's also has a history. He wasn't the first to do that. It was like rediscovered, because in some ways the muckraking journalism of the socialist era was a kind of gonzo journalism, actually.
Right.
And then people forgot it, and then they had to rediscover it.
Right.
And we might be, in a similar moment of having to rediscover these things.
Right. And the thing about that, though, and then we will shift, is like the Socialist Party, the struggle for socialism can't be a taste community.
Right.
But that kind of approach to exposing the way that discourse functions and becoming extreme has developed into a taste community.
It has. And that's the unfortunate thing. I mean, the thing is that what was avant-garde always becomes kitsch.
Mm-hmm.
What was political always becomes sub-political and cultural.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have to ride the wave of it, meaning we have to understand that, of course, anything that we do is in danger of this. Again, in danger of succumbing to the power of the status quo.
Right.
And that's why we have to understand what it's in the service of. In other words, it's not an end in itself. Because as an end in itself, then it's totally appropriable by capitalism.
Right.
Right. Any form that imagines that through that form alone it's going to solve the problem, actually that makes it liable to assimilate it back into capital.
Right. All right. Let's talk about that in the second half, the theory and practice split. And thanks for coming by again. And everyone, thanks for watching. Go to the Patreon to get the second half, and I'll see you there. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.